Welcome everyone, Prince and the Makers Book Club, Season 2, Episode 6 with special guest tonight, Shelley Langdale. As always, we start off with kind of a larger concept or theme, and we felt it was only appropriate for this evening that it'd be the big word, the capital C word of culture. What that means, who gets to decide, how it evolves, and all of the baggage that that word carries with it, as well as all of the promise that it carries. And so we'll be doing this a bit through the lens of the National Gallery, as well as the lens of all of the 30 plus years of experience that Shelley has as a curator, and has, brings for her focus and love of modern and contemporary art. And so I wanted to start off with some of the things that, for me, the National Gallery really represents, which is a lot of the things that we all in the print world know and love, kind of the greatest hits of Western art. So these Rembrandt works are, ones that if you love printmaking, especially Italian printmaking, ones that you know very well. And the nice part about the National Gallery's collection are their study rooms, and you can actually see this stuff in person and make appointments to go see it. But one of the things I really love about the National Gallery's collection, and from that kind of culture perspective, is that it's not just the greatest hits of an artist, but there's many of the artists they have in depth. And so when you take Rembrandt, for instance, there's many prints of his that you may or may not be familiar with, which gives you a different understanding of his time, his view of the world, his subject matter, and why that matters to us today. It allows you to have those comparisons. And these are some of those prints that you don't normally get to see, but really showcase his ability as a draftsman and what he had to think about. And the landscapes are, personally, there's a really nice holding of the landscapes at the National Gallery, are some of my favorite things to dive into, because these are small prints that get packed with tons and tons of detail. So that zoom in on the right is really zoomed in, and you really get this sense of how he finds his line and how he uses line to sculpt as an artist, which is something that's really rare. And in this other context of the capital C of culture, when we're thinking of Western culture, it's very difficult to separate white, European, Christian focus as what is being often meant with that statement when you're talking about culture in America. It has that lens that's been applied to it. And that's because of a lot of institutionalized racism and institutionalized perspective of the founding of this nation. And so when you look at the structure or the foundation of the collection at the National Gallery, it's very much representative of that idea of America in its beginnings, but it's something that grows over time. And so when you think of the collection and the holdings of Dürer, it has an amazing array and swath, and has so much of his religious themes and religious work. And something that I talk about a lot when I talk about Dürer was how he used these themes to make comments on his time, at a time when depicting images from the Bible was something that was somewhat radical, especially this being before the Reformation. And when to see these in this way, to see the image on the right of Dürer as a young man doing a woodcut of Christ carrying the cross, versus him as an older artist, not really old man, but an older person, of Christ carrying a cross as an engraving, it really shows his evolution of the theme and the way in which the figures are portrayed and the emotions that are carried. And so there's a lot of symbolism that carries through when we talk about that capital C culture. Another part of that dialogue is, when you think of someone like the work of Mary Cassatt. And, it really depicts a very specific slice of American culture. And in a lot of ways is something that's been, it's definitely been canonized and idolized in more recent history, though it wasn't in her day when she was making this work, which is another interesting point of part of that evolution of what culture is and what the canon of art is. But one of my more amazing things from the National Gallery's perspective is the fact that they have the different state proofs. And you can really watch how the artist evolved the work. You can see her thinking process outlaid right in front of you, especially when you get to see the plates printed in black and then how they're then used in color. It's quite extraordinary thing to be able to sit with in person. So, for me, I encourage you guys to take advantage of that if you're in DC. Another aspect of it is that, it's a collection that spans hundreds of years worth of time. And so you get snippets of, especially from the American work, of American culture and American perspective from different artists at different time periods. The collection of Bellows and the collection of Edward Hopper really, in my mind, outline a lot of the anxiety and the kind of stress that was leading up to the Great Depression in the 1920s in the United States. It was a tumultuous time in the US on a lot of economic as well as cultural levels. And there was a great deal of change that was in the air. And it's really evident in a lot of the graphic work. But one of the other things that's happening within the collection is also the other side of culture that has not necessarily been championed within its day, and is really, trying to come into more of a holistic understanding of the history of the United States, would be works like by Ernest Critchlow or Elizabeth Catlett from the earlier periods for them, the late 30s and the 40s, which really depicts the other side of American culture. And when we think about that kind of Western European white focus of the dominance of how the United States was really set up and what it aspired to be, and who it did not include in that dream. The work of these artists is extremely important to not only collect, but also to, more important, to be in the national collection, because it's a greater understanding of American culture. And Shelley will talk a little bit about some of Emma Amos's work later, and how this work gets into the collection. And we'll discuss, some of the evolution of the national collection and how people are thinking about evolving collecting and working on evolving collecting, and who is included in the canon. And I wanted to end on this one because this is, it's in the National Gallery, which this suite of work by Willis Thomas is unbelievably powerful. If you ever get a chance to see it in person, it's amazing in reproduction. And it says so much about American culture, with not just the image, but then when you add on the title, which is, "And One" from the Strange Fruit series, referencing the famous Nina Simone song, Billie Holiday song. And when we think about our national collection, and part of our conversation tonight, it's really about thinking about who we are, who we have been, and who we can be, and how we evolve that as a concept and as a group over time. And so we have an amazing person to help talk about this tonight, and help us understand where things are, and get a greater lens and kind of a peeling behind the curtain with Shelley Langdale. She's the curator and head of modern and contemporary prints at the National Gallery. She started her career off at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and later at the Cleveland Museum of Art, and spent 17 years at the Philadelphia Museum of Art before landing at the National Gallery of Art right before everything shut down. So we, as a group, have not yet had the chance to get to see Shelley's work majorly in action. But I'm really looking forward to the work that she's been doing behind the scenes, and she's going to show us some of that work that she's been working on, and we'll have a really wonderful and robust conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this over to Shelley.
Thank you so much, Phil. And I just want to say how much I'm really honored to be here in your lineup tonight, because you've had some really wonderful talks through your book club events. I've enjoyed them quite a bit and have watched some that I haven't been able to attend. So thank you for inviting me, and I've really enjoyed our conversation so far. One thing as you were presenting the works you chose to highlight from the collection, I've been thinking a lot about this, as we're trying to strategize about, how do we expand the canon? What does that mean? The fact that we're, I think every institution is in a, you have to take into consideration your environs. I mean, we are now, the National Gallery is in a city of museums of all kinds, including quite a few art museums. And I think that we are all, I remember, I think it was like 2016, there was an article on the front page of the New York Times about storage crises in museums, right, and how everybody was running out of space, which when you are just coming to the realization that you've left a a huge number of artists out of the canon also raises some, very pragmatic issues of how to handle that. And one of the things that, again, that struck me as you were talking about Mary Cassatt, right? Is that she's an American artist who lived in Paris. I mean, this sort of homage that Americans and our culture has been set up to look to Europe as our model. I mean, the National Gallery is modeled on the National Gallery in London. Right. So we have, great European, the mission was focused on great European art. We didn't even have great strength in American art. That really came along later. And actually, Frank Kelly, my colleague, is in the throes of writing a book about American art at the National Gallery, because it sort of had to earn its way into a more robust representation. So I think that in thinking about that, or all of these different factors, I've been thinking a lot about really, and we, like you said, I haven't really had a chance to fully do this yet, but I have started to reach out and talk to a number of my colleagues at different institutions and really brainstorm about what does expanding the canon at each of our institutions look like. So we have different strengths and weaknesses. We have different areas we could build on. In certain cases, it makes sense for, multiples of us to collect certain artists, but collect them in ways that we're getting objects that will relate specifically to other works in the collection and provide us kind of dialogue and context. So these are all, some of the things that I've been thinking about. And what I thought I'd do is just sort of share with you some of my recent acquisitions and how I came to them. I should start off by saying too that, like many museums, but I think in my experience at the National Gallery so far, we do get many gifts from a lot of different people who are interested in giving to the National Gallery. And so I think people aren't always conscious of all the different ways that shape our collections. Certainly, and so I'm starting off with one that I have to say, is one of the examples of sort of serendipity, because, and this is very common among all of us, particularly at the print fair, because you're wandering through the print fair and you stumble into something that you didn't even know existed. So I only had one print fair before we closed down for the pandemic.
That's right.
That was in person in my current position. And I ran into these two really lovely, quite small Eva Hesse prints. And I honestly was not aware that she made prints. I had learned quickly that Madeleine Valjean had acquired one for the New York Public Library not long before. But I was particularly struck by these two because, to me, although she was quite young, she was at Yale in graduate school at the time that she did these. And they only exist, the horizontal one exists, I believe, in one impression, and the larger one exists in two, as far as we know. She made about 30 prints, including some woodcuts and lithographs, most in not more than a couple impressions, many only in one or two. And I find them fascinating for what I have read as sort of foretellings of some of her aesthetic issues and ways of thinking about things. So looking at what we had this 1954 subway lithograph, which is somewhat figural, that she did actually, I think, at the Cooper Union School. We had this 1961 drawing, which was around the time that she had her first show in New York after she graduated from Yale, when she was trying to be a painter. We had one of the fabulous color drawings that she did throughout her short life, since she only lived to be 34 years old. Right. And one of the things about Eva Hesse's drawing, and I think this is really pertinent to the two prints, or I came to understand in terms of the two prints that I found with Anders Bergstrom, was the one who I've been in deep discussions with, and is that the drawings that she did were sort of continuous throughout her life, involved in everything she did. So she drew sometimes very specifically as studies for certain projects. She drew freely as objects in and of themselves. And that's sort of how I've come to understand her printmaking work, is that there is much about the drawing and the mark making as about making an addition. I don't think she was that interested in making addition as she always was interested in materials and materiality. And so this is our test piece for contingent latex over cheesecloth, which is our only sort of installation sculptural work. But I just wanted to share with you sort of the kind of connections that I was making. And I tried to get a better detail, but it is very hard to see in this very delicate dry point and etching. But there are these incredible networks of lines. It looks like she probably took a plate that had some marks, some sort of stray marks on it, but then she went in and really drew tons of these little interconnected lines horizontally across what appears to be sort of an abstracted landscape scene. And I really felt like you could feel some of that same kind of aesthetic at work in her metronomic irregularity, which was a relief object that she made in 1966 that was in Lucy Lepard's famous abstraction show that really put her on the map. And then this work, and you can see this is a sugar lift print. Mm-hmm. But what I love about this is, at least for me, the more that I stared at it, what is background and what is foreground sort of goes back and forth. You can see the white is the background and the black being the solid form, or you can see the white as having some solidity with the black backdrop. And that sort of positive negative relationship that she explores so much in her work after her time in Germany, where she and her husband at the time, Tom Doyle, a sculptor, they had their studio in a deserted textile factory. And that's where she first came to use her latex tubing and all the kinds of materials that she was using and experimenting with different spatial relationships and vulnerability of forms too, which I think you really see in the earlier etching with those delicate lines and sort of veils of aquatint. But this actually, I thought, was very resonant with her rope piece, which is currently up right now in the craft show, in the Craft as Art show at the Whitney, in terms of its sort of, you can see, the forms by the draping rope, the kinds of positive and negative spaces that result. So I think there's a lot more work, to be done on Hesse's etchings. And I thought they added sort of a nice precursor to some of the works we had in terms of her aesthetic thinking.
Right, and she would have, with her time in Yale, she would have overlapped with Gabor Paterdi. He would have been her printmaking teacher at the very end, right?
Rico Lebrun, she studied with Rico Lebrun and Bernard Chayet. And Joseph Albers.
Because Paterdi came in 60, I think, is when
he got so Yale. She was gone. She left in 59.
Okay. I was wondering, because it does have a sense of some of his sense of freedom.
Absolutely.
Because he was teaching at Hunter before he went to Yale, but yeah.
Right. No, I mean, that's what the organicness of these too, I thought was really striking given who she's working with.
Yeah.
I think some of the tonality things and some of the bold graphicness of this work, you can kind of see with Rico to a degree. Right. But what I was really struck by, particularly, let me go back a minute. Stop it. Particularly in this one, this was the one I really, it shows her interest in line and these sort of just really beautifully delicate layers that are almost like clouds or some kind of atmospheric sort of form, I thought they felt very fragile. And I think you get a lot of that in the kinds of materials that she used, like they're not very sturdy, like they're not solid.
Well, and you can see her using the medium in a way it wasn't quote unquote intended for at the time, right? It wasn't. Yes. Because she wasn't trying to like build an image in the Rembrandt style.
Right. Right.
And that tradition, she was really using it in the way in which she worked as an artist, which is evident in the other work you're showing.
And very far from the hard edges of Joseph Albers.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
It's about as night and day as you're going to get. Yeah.
So the other thing that was happening, because I arrived in 2019 and 2020, there were many of which were aborted, but the acknowledgements of, in that time period, of the 100th anniversary of the suffragist, the women's right to vote, we had done a lot of work examining our collection of women artists, and how many women artists there were and when they had come into the collection. And it's like most institutions, it is not a high percentage. Only 1,000, there are only 1,100 or so women artists in the collection. And an overwhelming number of those are in works on paper, not surprising. Right. But one of the interesting discoveries, and this has been really fascinating to me, and Liz, I know Liz Spungen is here too, and it was so interesting when I was in Philadelphia as well, to realize how much Lessing Rosenwald really shaped collections. He did not give as much to Philadelphia. His plan always was to found the collection at the National Gallery. He collected very widely from medieval to at what would have been in the 1940s until he died in 1979, contemporary work, contemporary to him. And I discovered that the first work by an African-American artist was given by Lessing in 1959. And he gave 10,000 works when the museum opened in 1943. And over his lifetime, he gave over 24,000 prints to the collection. And we have somewhere around 120,000 total works on paper in the collection. So he gave us.
Yeah, just to reiterate what you said for everybody, it took 16 years for an African-American artist to enter the collection. And it was with one print, and, we have a comment here that talks about the case for printmaking as being something that is highly important, even though it might be a technical process, but really highly important as far as making a record, and a record that can be preserved through institutions, because works on paper are easier to store, going back to your early comment of, you have to have a place to put things, right? And so the works on paper is a way to make that happen. There was a quick question just to catch you while you're at this point too, is with the 1,100 women artists in the collection, do you know how many male artists there are?
I should have looked that up again. I don't know the number of male artists offhand. I believe our percentage of works in the collection, and we have about, I think 100, I think we have close to 175,000 things, something like that. I know that the percentage of actual objects is about between 5 and 7% overall in the collection. So it's a very small amount. It's a very small amount. And the statistics, I think, actually may have been published in Diana Greenwald's article, which I can send to anybody who's interested in. She was a fellow at the museum who was doing a lot of the statistical analysis of all of this when we were working on the project. It was aimed to be an exhibition that ended up, like many things because of the pandemic, not happening. But we're hoping that it will stay tuned, because we're hoping that the information that we collected and some of the ideas will be presented on the web in the future. Yeah. But one of the extraordinary things about Norma Morgan, and we really have Christina Weil, Christina Weil to thank for that, is because she included a lot of new information about Norma Morgan in her book on students from the Atelier 17, women artists working at the Atelier 17 with Stanley William Hayter. And Norma was one of two African-American artists who worked there around 1950 in New York, in his New York studio. This little abstract, very Hayter-esque looking color etching is quite small. It's only about that big. Is currently hanging in the Whitney show, Labyrinth of Forms, about abstract women artists sort of working mid-century. And it is the only known impression of this print, at least that has surfaced thus far. And shortly after she was in Hayter's studio around 1950, she got a John Hay Whitney grant to go to England and became very enamored of the moors in Scotland and England. And that basically became her subject matter for the rest of her life. And, and she just died in 2017. So this, and I want to note that this engraving, and yes, it is an engraving, which with all of the incredibly hard work that entails of carving into a hard metal plate, it is 39 inches tall and 26 inches wide, which is enormous. And it is extraordinary. I mean, she talks a lot about how engraving is the perfect medium to use to capture the incredible textures and crevices of these incredible rock formations.
Yeah, I'm going to encourage any print nerd out there, if you do not know Norma Morgan's work, it is worth going down the rabbit hole, and you will come out the other side jaw on the floor, because yeah, as you were saying, the scale of this is insane, that this is an engraving. And the use of aquatint for some of those softer tones in there is really wonderful comparison as well.
Yeah, well, and I'm sorry I didn't have a better detail, but the line work in the sky is just extraordinary as well. I mean, you can tell that she was truly a printmaker at heart. Yeah. But again, she's one of the people that, and one of the African-American artists in particular, that has not gotten much attention because, and Phil and I were talking about this too, because she doesn't do the expected subject matter of African-American figures, or protest, or, you know, any of the sort of more that have a more political bent to them. And many people probably did not realize that she was African-American.
Right, and it's one of those, it says as we discussed too, it's one of the fallout characteristics of institutionalized racism, is that all of these cultural expectations get placed on cultures that don't have the power or the say to represent their culture as full and diverse as it actually is. And you know, this is like one of those prime examples of it's so important to show as wide a range of what artists across the cultural spectrum have been working on to get a fuller understanding of what that culture with capital C actually means, versus these really narrow, you know, Western European, you know, moneyed class expectations of what that means. And so, you know, her work, it's absolutely stunning, and you know, it's hopefully gets its day. I know you're doing your job to try to get it out there in the world.
Well,
so
yeah, well, and I mean, I have to say, Dolan Maxwell too in Philadelphia, they did a show recently. And Liz Baby Spungen can put, if she remembers, I'm now forgetting the location. I think it was in Easton, PA. Did a really nice little catalog, and just, you know, anybody who loves engraving, she was an extraordinary engraver at a time that, you know, aside from, you know, the Hayter-esque, very abstract kind of engraving work, people were not doing 39-inch engravings of landscape in 1956. So she was quite extraordinary. And she ended up, I think in the end, she had a couple more grants, and then a Tiffany grant. I mean, she was very successful at getting grants, and then ended up working. She never married. She ended up taking care of her mother somewhere in New England, and just making her prints. Right. So anyway, I was very excited that we at least had something that early on. Again, thanks to Lessing. I mean, he you know, he was an incredibly insightful lover of prints, really. I think he just went for what was interesting.
Exactly.
So, I mean, we are all looking at ways to quote unquote diversify our collections, to expand our, the stories that we can tell, the artists that we've represented and may have left out, and voices that, are important to include in the canon. And when I did an exhibition in 2012 in Philadelphia of artists who worked at the Brandywine workshop, Emma Amos was one of the artists who had worked there, and I was very taken with her work. And I was able to have a few conversations with her. And I really felt like, wow, this is an amazing artist who, has early on in the 60s and 70s and 80s, she was already, to me, doing things that you were seeing later in Willis Thomas and others. And I think she was an important predecessor to a lot of these people that are getting attention now, but she got lost in the shuffle because of her generation. And she grew up in Atlanta. Her father was a pharmacist, a fairly successful pharmacist. They actually were very involved in the cultural community in Atlanta. Her parents had a lot of literary friends. She, W.E.B. Du Bois visited their house. She went to Antioch College and actually studied printmaking and textiles in England for a year, and came back. My favorite strange fact is that she was at Antioch College with Catherine Brown, who founded Crown Point Press, although they never worked together. But printmaking was really something of interest to her early on. But being a Black woman, it was hard to get a gallery. It was hard to make any kind of career for yourself in the early 60s when she had graduated from college. And she ended up in New York, and Hale Woodruff and Romare Bearden, Hale Woodruff being from the Atlanta area, and Romare Bearden and Norman Lewis and the others who were founding the artist collective Spiral, the Black artist collective around the time of the March on Washington. The purpose of the collective was to come together and decide what role Black artists should play in this civil rights moment. Was abstraction viable in this moment? And could abstraction be political? How could they sort of contribute to the cause? And Emma was the only woman and the youngest member. And in reflecting on that later in the 80s, when she was interviewed, she said that she really thought that was probably mostly because she was young, and Camille Billups and Faith Ringgold had both been turned down for membership because they were too opinionated and would not be as perhaps submissive or go along as she might be at her young and tender age and beginning of her career.
I can definitely concur that Camille Billups and Faith Ringgold would probably be very proud to have been labeled as opinionated.
Yes.
and I'm glad that they always have been, because their opinions have been very important. So
exactly. Well, and it's funny because Emma actually apparently tried to connect with Hale Woodruff when she was in Atlanta, and he was like, not that interested. But once she got to New York, and then it was okay. And he did end up being more supportive. But anyway, the reason I wanted to bring up the works that I collected by her is because, it's one of the approaches that I've been taking with artists like Emma, who often, just by the nature of their career, although she worked throughout her, she worked as an artist. She ended up teaching for many years, but she started off by designing textiles for a famous textile designer. She did a short, actually, I think it was a 2-year PBS craft show. She worked in all kinds of jobs, anything she could get, basically, until she finally landed a job teaching at Rutgers. but never had really purposeful gallery representation until very, very late in her life.
Right.
And so she worked with Kathy Caraccio, she printed at Bob Blackburn's workshop, but always in pretty small editions, mostly because of cost. And so I wanted to be sure that I jumped in as soon as I could, because her work has become very popular, to get a range of things from across her career, because I knew it might not be possible later. It wasn't the kind of thing where I'll collect something and then maybe later on I can collect more. So I worked with Ryan Lee Gallery, who represents her. And I actually did make a conscious decision not to buy a larger, what is sort of considered signature work of hers with 3 women. MoMA bought it, the Philadelphia Museum bought it, and it's currently in the show of Emma Amos's that's in Philadelphia right now. But I made the conscious decision that I'd rather have a range of things than that and maybe one other thing.
And
so
I
just want
to point out too, like what we were talking about before, is that points to you not trying to duplicate what's in other institutions, so that there's more of her work in institutions. Right?
Yes.
So that it's possible to put a show together because the work is in places that it can be borrowed from and put together. But if everybody buys the same thing, then there's only one thing of her work that exists, and it's really hard to put her in an appropriate context. I think, that being your focus at the National Gallery, I think is really important to highlight for everyone, that you're trying to show the depth of an artist so that it's available for scholarship and collection.
Well, and also, and it works 2 ways. So I want to show her range and her depth in our representation of her work, but I also want to have the opportunity to show her work in different contexts, so that I could have more opportunities to have her work included in installations or exhibitions. So the first one, the earliest work is from 1966. So she's 29 years old. And she's, still in this moment where she's, sort of doing various jobs, and she does eventually go and get her MA in education from, I can't remember which one it is. Maybe if you want to say the City Museum, but it's not the City Museum, it's CUNY. And what I love about this is that she is young, and it's a self-portrait, and she's very much in the lower register. Mm-hmm. So and she sort of has this kind of coy look about her. She doesn't, and she's not showing her whole body. And it also has this wonderful sort of poppy screen print, abstract, bright colors in the background that's sort of its moment. I'm just showing you as an example, another work that sort of came to mind when I first saw it, by the Belgian artist Evelyn Axel, Woman with Ice Cream, just to show you that sort of, even that palette was sort of a popular range at that time. And then I wanted Sister Corita Kent was another one who sort of came to mind just from a purely visual sense. But then I discovered the February issue of Ebony magazine, and we know that Lorna Simpson and other African-American artists, women African-American artists, often cull from Ebony and Jet, sometimes literally in collaging, like the deluxe, Ellen Gallagher's incredible deluxe portfolio that mimics even the square boxes of this format that you see on the cover of Ebony magazine. And the title of this article just really got me, Are Negro Girls Getting Prettier? Noting that they all are sporting very white hairstyles. And that was shortly after that moment of 66 was a very hot topic for letting your hair go naturally and being and having a more natural hairstyle. And there were several letters to the editor about the article. And it was a fascinating range from just being disappointed that a particular university was not represented to being horrified that white type hairstyles on Black women were being lauded. But I think it really registers with sort of where this pose was coming from for her. And then on the completely other end of the scale, 14 years later, we have her self-portrait as Pool Lady, which is first of all, a gorgeous aqua tint. Phil and I were talking earlier, and I said it, I sort of also refer to this as a rumination in brown, because the paper itself is this beautiful sort of tan beige color. And then the different colors of brown aqua tint are just really luscious. And this is done in the year that she took her position in a tenure track job teaching at Rutgers in the art department. And suddenly we've gone from that sort of coy, younger woman to this very confident, sort of proud figure who's really looking at us with her hand on her hip in this very confident and somewhat sexy pose. Oops, sorry. And there were several other things I liked about this, going back to the beginning of our conversation about the National Gallery sort of standing as this, canon of Western art, in that she is also chosen to take on the bather, sort of one of the greatest tropes of Western art of all time, going back to antiquity. And that's on the one hand. On the other hand, as Phil brought up, there are also all of the sort of loaded subject matter around pools and Black culture and the segregated pools, or pools that don't allow Black people in, or parts of the beach where only white people are allowed to be. In fact, the 1918 riot in Chicago started because a young Black boy accidentally ended up in an area that was supposed to be restricted to whites. So she's owning a lot here.
Yeah, it's a pretty loaded image. Yeah.
In choosing this. But I also love that the feminist in me loved that she is not overly voluptuous, that she is a model of a female body that is very beautiful, but not exaggeratedly well endowed. And I also think it's important to pull out from, to point out, and this would have been very true for Emma, who was a very active political person, that it also rings or reminds you of the mantras of Black is beautiful, and the personal is political, two sort of long-standing mantras of both the feminist and civil rights movements.
Right. I mean, it's just too, is like the anchoredness of the pose that she's taken on here, which it's an unshakable presence of a person. She's not going anywhere. And I think that in and of itself, taking on the extraordinarily white trope of the bather, especially the female bather, it meant a lot. And it's definitely she knew that when she was doing this work. I mean, she was a student of history and wanted to use that as part of creating her imagery to help people think about something differently, or to directly and actively engage people's stereotypes about things. So, I mean, on so many levels, she was making something that was extraordinarily beautiful, but extraordinarily powerful at the same time. And I think, if you want to like sum up her work in any way, that's the way I would sum her work up. Is extraordinarily beautiful and extraordinarily powerful. I think, she didn't shy away from things looking good, and I think that's something that a lot of artists have difficulty with, but she never did. She was always
and again, I mean, like Eva Hesse really loved the possibilities of her materials. And I don't think that very bright white towel on her head is not purposeful. I think it's
exactly
very
right. I mean, it's the only area of the image that's untouched, and it's been, from a printmaking perspective, forced to be that bright.
Well, actually, right? It's added.
It's added.
It's a stenciled in, because the paper is tan.
It's buff, yeah. Right. So she's, I mean, for me, her work has always been one of those, at my time at the printmaking workshop and having got to meet her and speak with her a little bit and seen her work in that time period, it's always been one of those, I just don't understand why she's not famous. And it's one of those cases is that she was ahead of her time, and I think, the fact that you're spending the time to make sure that the National Gallery has a representation of her work is really important, because it's easy to just skip to today and making sure artists of today are being well represented and miss these periods of time. But from a national historic and cultural perspective, it's really important to have artists throughout the history of the United States, especially in the American section, to really help showcase that. And works like these are really great. So I'm grateful that you've collected them, because we know that they'll be there. So
well, yeah, and I think a lot of people, I think she's known to certain people. She's
right.
not, she was not, wrongly left out. She was shown a lot in different, sort of group shows and things, but for all the reasons we know, she was not robustly collected as she should have been.
Yeah.
But the last thing I'll just say is you have to appreciate the incredible textures and patterns from her, and ability to render textile is all from her experience as a weaver and maker. And that comes through. These were my fun tropes. So see how different is her bather compared to the many bathers in the Western art that came before. The power of her presence and her gaze at you really stands out after you sort of do a quick run through all of that. Right. And here's a close up so you can really see this, just the very, delicate burnishing to give a sense of the skin in such a beautiful way, and the highlights on her lips.
Yeah, I mean, if you guys have ever, I've seen this in person, and if you guys ever get a chance, this is something you could spend hours just hunting around for, because it's the type of work that she spent an unknowable amount of time working this plate in order to get it to do what you see there, because it's really difficult to gain tonal diversity in the light range and the dark range. And what she's done here to fully render, a Black woman's skin, her skin, is really, really challenging from a technical perspective, because it's hard to print and it's hard to see what you're doing. And so it would have required a great deal of patience and, determination. So I think when you put the technical aspect added into this as well, it really even further pushes, her reason for doing it, and doing it to this level, because it was so hard to do.
I know, and I think this detail, you can really see why I call it sort of ruminations in brown.
Yeah,
this is unbelievable, and it is beautiful, and it is Black is beautiful. It is absolutely that in manifestation. And here you can, look at the difference in sort of, the confidence in the second one, as opposed to where she was sort of in terms of her thinking about her own career 14 years earlier. And then this is a great one I wanted to bring up for two reasons. One is I think it relates really nicely to the way she goes about a lot of her printmaking, particularly with Kathy Caraccio. I know she used a lot of stencils. She used various means of collaging, offsets of photos and Xeroxes and things like that. And this is I didn't actually realize this until I really got to see it in person for the first time. It is not actually a collage. It is paper. It is paper that was made by tearing up this print in the upper left, American Girl, and using it to create a new sheet of paper using pouring paper pulp onto the form, and then it all gelled as paper. So you get these new women in their sort of striking poses and more abstract and less abstract forms. But she tore up this print. I'm praying that it was a poor proof or something that didn't work well, not a nicely edition print. But this was a very conscious choice on my part, both to show her the way that she worked in terms of revisiting older work, because this was done in 1981 and American Girl was part of an important portfolio from 1974 by all Black artists that Bob Blackburn printed. Right. That all the prints were in black and white, also purposefully so. And I knew that both the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian American Art Museum own American Girl. So I thought, I don't need to own American Girl because they have it. This is a great thing for us to get because it has this dialogue, but we would surely lend to one another if we ever wanted to do that, or somebody could come see this and just pop over there to see American Girl. So, yeah.
Right. I mean, I think, you know, the fact that she was reconstituting it as a single thing in and of itself, as a conceptual act, knowing that she as an artist, that was a big part, like process was a big part of the end product as well. So that tearing it apart and then making it a new thing versus it being a collage probably meant a great deal to her, just from a process perspective as part of the read of the work.
Yes.
And you know, it's you know, there was a question in here a little bit earlier about if she did her own inking and printing, and from my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that she did a lot of her own printing early on, and as her career progressed, she spent a lot of time working with printmakers at the printmaking workshop. So Kathy Caraccio, I know for sure she did a lot of work with. I believe she did some print. Muhammad Khalil did some printing for her as well. And I'm trying to remember if there was another artist. I'm trying to remember who printed the piece for this portfolio, the 1974 portfolio. Bob had contracted a series of printmakers at the workshop to do the work for that portfolio, because it was a big portfolio. So
yeah.
And it was Bob's way of keeping printmakers employed. So he'd get a grant and he'd be like, all right, you 5 artists are going to print this portfolio because you guys need some cash and they need some work made. And like that was Bob, like making sure everybody got covered in some way, you know, which piggybacks onto a question from Beauvais Lyons about if there's evidence or information about printmaking studios being more inclusive environments than painting or sculpture studios. From my experience, no. It was rare places like the printmaking workshop and workshops that spun off after the printmaking workshop, like the Brandywine workshop was an offshoot of the printmaking workshop. That self-help, where that diversity grew out of, but it was not a commonality from my experience. But what do you know? I mean, that's my understanding.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I mean, until more recently. Right. But no, I mean, Brandywine and Self-Help and Coronado, and then there were spinoffs from Self-Help like Coronado and others. And I actually should say that is another, just to go on a tangent for a little bit, we're trying to work on, I've been starting to pull together a list of printmaking workshops across the country, including a lot of these workshops. There are a couple of websites now up for that have Latinx workshops across the country. And we're trying to call more attention because there are some out there. They all, I think, came up after the surge in the early 70s with Self-Help, Brandywine, et cetera. They're newer, but they are also just not given credit or paid attention to, you know, and one of the other things that has been, you know, there are certain workshops that have worked with a lot of artists they do commercial work, but they also do, you know, have done offset lithography with artists like Romare Bearden and Elizabeth Catlett and other artists that have you know, we had a little discussion about the great printers like Phil and others don't make a real distinction between offset lithography and others, but I think there has been a prejudice against that in a connoisseurship sort of way because of its commercial associations. So a lot of artists, I mean, that was Brandywine's issue, was they did screen printing and then they did a lot of offset lithography that was then considered maybe not as fine art as other modes of printmaking.
Right. And
I
what I was pointing out in that conversation is that Jasper Johns is one of his most famous lithographs, Decoy, was printed on an
exactly,
offset press. And people just
exactly.
don't know. I mean, it's just a tool. I mean, it's no different. It's just a piece of equipment. It's all how the artist wants to wield it as what it is, if it's quote unquote commercial or not. And I think,
Right.
technical prejudices along with, racial and ethnic and gender biases are some of the problems that you're trying to combat, and what we're talking about, that stuff comes into being, and it's excluded a lot of voices. Screen print being relegated towards this other end of the art world for so long is another reason as well, because it was the more accessible medium for a lot of artists to be able to work. It was cheap and it was effective, a great way to get color and work at scale, but
Well,
it was
and
also seen in that same regard as being less than.
well, and both screen print and offset have the advantage of not having the reversal of an image. So if you're not a printmaker and you're not used to having to reverse the image to have it come out in the right direction the way you want it, you don't have to deal with that in screen print and offset.
Right. Yeah.
So it opens it up. But all right, I'm going way too slow. So, so to continue in the group, this was another image that I chose of from Emma's. Again, because this has a more specific reference, obviously, to some of the other male artists in particular that she was sort of taking on, if you will. This involves one of those cases where she's got the off print of the photograph that she has physically collaged onto this print. And this was made in Kathy Karacha's studio. And interestingly, the target, of course, especially in this moment with Jasper Johns everywhere, she was definitely pointing to Jasper Johns, but adding a figure, a Black male figure, of course, adding a certain power and potency to it. And even further, the palette that she chose, being so resonant. This was done in 1992, so apartheid was still very much raging. The more recent resonances, of course, are the revival of widespread use of the Pan-African flag at a lot of the protests after the George Floyd incidents, and even the superimposition of the Black Lives Matter lettering on top of the Pan-African flag has come out with the Black Lives Matter movement. So this continues to resonate in a really powerful way and amplify some of the issues that she was dealing with in that moment. And it also reveals her more painterly side and interest in aesthetics. And I can't help but seeing, both sort of Borofsky and Boyce hinted at here with the silhouetted man as well, which I am quite sure, knowing Emma, that was also purposeful.
Oh, definitely. I mean, without a doubt. I mean, especially with Boyce, being that position of, the artist, the ex-Nazi, and what that meant, and culpability, and all of that would have been being talked about at this, especially with. As a comment was just made, this was made 1 year after the beating of Rodney King. It was made 2 years after David Hammond's flag, African-American flag. And it's, so like it's a piece of its moment from a different voice and a different perspective that helps tell a fuller story of that period of time that's often not talked about.
Yeah. And sadly is still resonating in many of those exact ways, particularly in this moment. I mean,
right. And for the same reasons,
for the same reasons,
so I think that's, for her, I think some of the long-term relevance of Emma Amos's work is that, unfortunately, a lot of what she was working to, point out still needs to be pointed out.
And I think too, I mean, I thought a lot about this work in particular, and the outline of this silhouetted figure too, being like the chalk lines on dead bodies and things there. I think all of that, knowing Emma and what we know of Emma, was definitely, these are all purposeful things. None of this is not part of her overall message.
Yeah.
And then one of my favorite things, which is smaller, but and more recent, 2002, so not so long ago, is this fabulous semi-abstracted crown, which has, again, feel like we've been saying, so many resonances. Obviously, Afro, it's a carborundum etching, going back to Philadelphia and Doc's Thrash, who one of the artists who invented that particular approach to etching process. Love how she burnished out these, certain strands, and really, if you see it in person, I'm sorry, you can't truly convey the incredible texture and depth and density of it. But if you're in Philadelphia, you can see it in the show there. It has resonances with her textiles and fabric, and it looks like a ball of yarn. It looks like a headdress. I love, and a little hard to see here, but all of these little sort of stray carborundum marks up here give it a real sense of vibration and movement. Almost like, it could be a dancer's garb, a giant full skirt of some sort. And I think she would have been happy with any of those. But it's a nice example, and it goes like the paper pulp piece into a more abstract mode that she did get into. So I think it adds yet another layer of her work, and could fit, like I said, all of these could fit in very different places in different kinds of shows or installations or study room visits.
This kind of goes, you're speaking kind of to a question that came up earlier, which was from a curator's perspective, the difference between, say, collecting a series that was at a period of time versus collecting vertically over time. From your perspective, I mean, you were really trying to, you chose the vertical format as a means of being able to make her work more accessible in a lot of different ways. And is that something that this gets back to something we talked about, which is that more of a personal focus, or is that an institutional focus? To help people kind of get an understanding of that perspective, because that was a really conscious decision on your behalf.
Yes.
So that people understand like how these things get decided upon.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think this is true, unfortunately, of a number of artists like Emma, who, maybe weren't as recognized as they should have been in their time. Who were not creating, or just feasibly could not create, because she had a full-time teaching job, giant bodies of work. So it's rarer. And I am looking backwards. So I have the advantage that I can collect across her career. With a newer artist, I have to hold open the idea that I might want to collect something else further down the line. And so I guess personally, I do tend to think vertically,
right?
Because particularly if I collect a work by a young artist, I don't want to just have their early work. They're going to have a longer life, and they're going to continue to make contributions. So I want to make space for that. But I think that, like I said, I did, in selecting these, I had taken stock of what was at some of, at SAM and at the Library of Congress, so that I knew I was filling a gap sort of for our city and our immediate region. So that was another good reason to work that way. But it is, as we were saying, and I think it's one of the interesting things about curators and collecting for institutions. I am not going to pretend that I am, completely objective. No one is completely objective. I mean, Phil, you and I were talking about, Carl Zagrosser was friends with a bunch of artists like Edward Hopper. Why do you think there's a great Edward Hopper collection in Philadelphia?
Exactly.
I mean, there's letters about him naming some of his prints. So they were kind of tight. So yeah, of course, there's the opportunity to get those prints came to Philadelphia in a way that it might not have come to other places. And so I think we have to take that into consideration. I think we try. I think, to the extent that we can, to think objectively about, how can we build on strengths, fill gaps. And in fact, I'll skip over this. Speaking of filling a gap, I showed up and was shocked to find that the National Gallery of Art, with its strong American modernist collection in many respects, particularly somebody like Georgia O'Keeffe, did not own a single Arthur Wesley Dow woodcut, which was shocking to me because Dow was such an important voice and teacher for Max Weber, who went on to share a lot of the aesthetic ideas that Dow put forward about composition and no tan, massing of dark and light, and all kinds of modernist principles, published in his famous composition art textbook. And Georgia O'Keeffe, that was really the turning point for her, was taking Dow's summer classes for the Columbia School. And yet we had nothing, no examples of his. We had one photograph, which that's not really what Georgia O'Keeffe was being inspired by.
Exactly.
So I was very fortunate. I very purposely went out, and I wanted, it would have been nice to have more. Unfortunately, here's a case where the last group of works was released from his estate maybe 5 years ago now, 4 or 5 years ago, and the National Gallery, for whatever reason, missed out on that. And so they're hard to find now. And so I was eager to find one of these sort of what are considered, his like major statements that are, very more minimal, where he's mixing blocks to create different subjects over several subjects. And it's Marsh Creek was the one that came up. There's also Moonlight and others that have just some of the same blocks, and others were used to create a whole moon instead of a 3/4 moon. But the greatest fun for me was I bought a different impression of this exact print as a fellow, my first fellowship I had out of grad school at the Harvard Art Museum. I had a $10,000 stipend to buy a work of art as part of my fellowship. And this is the print that I bought for them. Different impression.
We won't say how long ago.
No, but yeah, I was like, so that was just a funny thing. But so now I'm thrilled that we have at least one prime example. So I'm as we're diversifying, I'm thinking about gaps in every sense.
Right.
And in terms of how we can better represent American art and European art across time.
And I think it's important to point out too, is that when you're going backwards to fill holes in the collection and the story of American art across American culture, it gets more expensive, right? So because, if in its time, things were being seen differently, right? A wider array of culture was being appreciated and supported and seen as American culture. We wouldn't have the gaps to fill, and it wouldn't cost as much money to fill them now. And I think, it's a really important thing to point out, is that, in order to help rewrite and write the canon of American art history at the National Gallery and other institutions, it's going to be expensive. And unfortunately, it's generally not directly supporting the artists or their heirs at this point, because you're having to buy it on the open auction market and through dealers and things like that, where and you're not necessarily going to be able to get access to the best work, and it makes it difficult in that regard for institutions.
Well, and I think and it's just in certain cases like the Dow, it's just rarer. There's less out there. A lot of things like Dow are already in a number of institutions. Exactly. So there's less out there to find. But also I think, it's one of the hardest parts about working with modern and contemporary is, is buying current things because seeing an artist's work that you think is interesting, but they're very young and you don't know which way, you don't know how they're going to go. Sometimes you just have that sort of visceral reaction that, wow, this is a really amazing thing, and you get it. Right. But if you often find yourself wishing, darn, I wish I'd bought that 5 years ago or 10 years ago. I mean, and there's no way around that. I mean, you have to take the leap. And that is a fairly subjective thing when you're dealing with new artists, right? Because you're thinking about how their work, how, it holds together aesthetically, how it might relate to other works in the collection. Is it going to have a context? How would you show it? And in cases where you're trying to build new areas, you don't have a lot of context. So then you have to come up with a plan of how you're going to build that context.
Right. Right. And then you also have to come up with a plan of how you're going to pay for it and where you're going to put it.
Exactly.
So it's a complicated soup. I mean, on the print dealers and publishers end, my end, I've had works that only ended up in collections because there was a random available flat file space because they were oversized works. And it was like, it's a particular project that went to the Library of Congress because it was like a set of map drawers from the monuments division were vacated. And so there was a space to put them, and it was a gift, so it wasn't like they weren't even having to purchase it. Right. It was just, they had to have a place to go. Otherwise they couldn't say yes. And I think, for the artists on the other side of the institutional wall, sometimes it's something as annoying as, well, we don't have a place to put it. And, that can be problematic for certain types of work, especially work that's dimensional or, when you think of like Ellen Gallagher's deluxe suite that came framed, and it came framed. A lot of people don't know this. It came framed so that it had a better chance of surviving, right? Because the images themselves are so physical. It's like, well, how are you going to stack these things? Right. So it became a very practical decision. Well, we just go ahead and frame it all, and you get it framed, because an institution could collect it framed way easier than they could collect it unframed, but they wouldn't necessarily want to take on the expense of, or even having to justify the line. Well, we're going to buy this, but we have to frame it immediately, or it requires customized storage boxes, right? So it was a brilliant publisher's decision to go, we're just going to sell it to you framed, because that's the only way we're going to ensure that it survives. Well,
and none of us ever want to be in the position of saying, oh, we can't take that because we have no place to put it. Right. We can't take this amazing work because there's no place to put it. Right. So I think, we try to avoid that, but I do think that there is, I feel like there is a tendency as we're now fully in the third decade of the 21st century, which seems impossible. We do have to think more strategically about, how many things are we taking in, how are we going to care for them in the long run? Do we need this many things? How many do we need to be appropriately representative? What can we care for? Those kinds of questions, I think we are starting to ask in different ways across the field. Right. Because of, you can't, well, you don't want to say you can't take something because it doesn't fit. At the same time, there is some reality to being good stewards. We are curators. We are supposed to be stewards of these works in perpetuity. And we don't want to be irresponsible about caring for things.
Yeah, and it's tough too when you're thinking about evolving perspectives on the collection itself too, and setting up those mechanisms to reevaluate the lens that's been used for acquisitions over time, because you inherited your predecessor's lens on how the collection was to be operated, and the institution's prior lenses. And it's dealing with, creating that mechanism to allow it to be able to evolve over time so that it can be more reflective. So it's not just stewardship, but it's also it's legacy issues and then planning for the next steward, right? So it's
Right.
recognizing that this is your time with it, and that keeping it open for that next person to bring in that next perspective, and I think that's
Yeah.
that's a difficult position to be in.
Well, and I think, it's interesting, as we said, there's always some level of subjectivity. And in certain ways, that can be a positive thing too. I mean, because the other challenge for curators is to figure out sort of what's still under the radar. Where's an area that you can collect right now that has wonderful things that people haven't really collected much. I mean, when I've been doing some work on the Ruth and Jacob Canon collection of modern German works, mostly first half of the 20th century. And they were talking about when they were collecting, you could get, Schmidt, Rottluff, and Kirchner for nothing.
Yeah.
Because it was post-war and people were not really interested as much in that. And it was a pretty inexpensive market and it was something they could buy. Now those things are extraordinarily expensive.
Yeah, it's almost
monks go for
yeah.
$500,000 for God's sake. So I think that's something that we're always trying to do too. I mean, in Philadelphia, it was always funny because it's one of the major museums that doesn't have the way Boston or the National Gallery or the Art Institute of Chicago have like deep Durer collections and deep Rembrandt collections, because the Mr. Phillips, who was the base of who was the main collector of the 40,000 prints that came over from the Pennsylvania Academy to Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Museum in the 1980s. When he was collecting in the 19th century, German Romanticism, late 18th, early 19th century German things were nothing. Right. So he has incredible like Karl Kolbe and like, Schinkel and all these incredible things that are hard to find now and really great impressions, and Philadelphia has them. So it's part of what, is I think enjoyable for curators about what are the quirky strengths of your collection because of some of this subjectivity in both the collectors that have donated things, friendships that curators have had with artists or collectors. There's so many factors that go into shaping what is in a collection. Right. And so I think, the succession of curators is always trying to fill gaps where there were either blind spots or just not opportunities, as well as sort of take advantages of the moment.
Right. And it's, as a plug for help for you, so much of it requires a little bit of proactivity on behalf of collectors who have some of this stuff of saying, I wonder if this would be of value to be in context or conversation with, say, the National Gallery or the Metropolitan Museum of Art or a regional art center where that work may make more sense, and say, well, we have some pretty special things. Maybe we should think about that, because, it's, I always feel for families who are like, well, we don't know what to do with it. Should we just sell it and take the money? But I'm always like, please let other people have it, let people know it exists. It's so that it can live its life and still have greater influence, because that's how an artist achieves that ability to influence beyond their time, is the work surviving to be able to still be seen and be able to be put in context, and if and institutions are the only place that we have access to that work as the public.
And I think as our curatorial cohort, I think is really good about, if it's something, say, that we already have, or it's an artist that we already have in depth, and it's not something that we feel would have the opportunity to be displayed very much. We will often recommend another institution that would greatly benefit from having that work given to them, and where it could be enjoyed, it might come out more often or have a better context or what. I mean, I think we're all very conscientious about not just randomly taking gifts.
Right.
You know, we also want to help you find the best place for these works to be.
Yeah. Right, because it's a pretty rare day when you get the treasure trove gift from a major collector who's done a really good job putting together a collection that tells a wonderful story or really fills a major gap. I mean, it was a real coup for the Library of Congress to get the printmaking workshop archive.
Oh,
and it was so much of the
absolutely.
reason for it was because it filled in this massive gap of people of color working in printmaking in the United States that was not represented in their collection at all. And so all of a sudden there was 1,800 artists and 2,200 works that were able to be collected like in one shot. But those things are so rare that they can happen for an institution to be able to really kind of update their historical perspective in that way. But it does require, it requires more than one curator to be able to find that stuff,
Yes.
It's hard.
Yes. Well, and I think, that's the other thing that's going to be interesting, I think, as we're moving forward, because many of the artists like Emma and, other Black artists, Latinx artists, Asian artists that were not getting the sort of, gallery representation and promotion that they deserved or attention that they deserved. A lot of that work is in private collections. There were people who appreciated the work, but they were private collectors, not public institutions. And I think I had that discussion with Jeff Lee at Ryan Lee Gallery about the Young American print that Emma Amos did, Young American Girl. And because I actually did buy an impression of that for Philadelphia and before I left, and he was like, I think we only know of like 3 impressions, but like, that's because those portfolios were given to community centers and things. And a lot of them ended up like all over the place. And so how many survived? Some are probably hiding still out there somewhere.
Some of them are probably under the artist's beds because it's like it was their copy of it and it's just tucked away in a corner in those studios.
I mean, I'm really excited about, how we can connect with folks. And I can understand, I mean, that's another big question is like, how are we appropriate, to your point about the artist not seeing this money now, how do you say to a collector, oh, we woke up and realized this is important, please give it to us. It's like we were too dumb to collect it back then. So I think you have to there's a lot of work to figure out how to do all of this appropriately. I think I have sought some opportunities, and I'm always happy when it's a situation where the artist family, it was on commission with a gallery or something. So the artist family is going to actually realize some of this money, or there's an arrangement with the dealer that's the situation. I always feel better about some of those transactions.
Right.
But it's complicated. It's very complicated. And I think, it's important to be strategic and be thoughtful. I really do hope we can, I think it's important as a field that we collect more consciously with our regional neighbors. And, because we can't all try and do the same thing, not in terms of it's not feasible from a money point of view. It's not feasible from a, care and storage point of view. And it just doesn't make a whole lot of logical sense. I mean, we should be collecting to expand the story in ways that we can literally build on the collection and expand the context that we have. And if we want to create a new context, because that's not represented by any of our other institutions, that's a different story.
That's a whole different conversation, which kind of brings up a question we had is, do you have a wish list right now? like stuff that you're working on trying to locate?
Yeah. I mean, I'm,
Can you share it with us?
yes. Well, I can share some of it. Although I should be careful because like, I don't know who else, I can't see who's here. And if I have other curatorial colleagues, I don't want them scooping me.
That's why I asked if you could share it with us.
Well, no, I mean, well, I'll share a gap with you. Okay. Which is, I mean, we've talked about this, Phil, because I was also shocked that we had like, really no Bob Blackburn to speak of, that we really needed to have greater representation of his work. And so that's an area that I really hope to build on.
Have you talked to Wes Cochran at all? Because I don't know if Wes and Missy Cochran's collection is committed to anyone.
Yeah, I have not. And I've Deborah Cullen and I have been trading emails
about, because she's she's the keeper of the torch. So
yes. But no, and and I mean, and I think I can say more broadly that we're definitely looking backwards and forwards. My colleague Mary Lee, who I think might still be here tonight, has been really doing a great job. She did a whole survey of Elizabeth Catlett in the area, since Elizabeth Catlett is from DC, somebody that we should have better represented. So she's been doing really great work. We just got 3 prints in the last year from her work that are not represented elsewhere in other local collections. So yeah, I mean, we're, like I said, we're trying to go backwards and forwards. I did recently get a Rashid Johnson screen print from his Anxious Red series. And we got a lovely donation from Oliver Lee Jackson of some drawings that relate to one of his paintings. Carrie James Marshall also gave us some really terrific drawings that relate to the painting that we acquired from by him. We're looking at, I am exploring, because we have such great representation of, the archives of Gemini, and we have a virtual archive basically of the Crown Point Press, because Catherine Brown has generously been donating her okay to print proofs to us. So we're sort of the East Coast counterpart to San Francisco's archival collection of Crown Point. And I think, we would like to have better, we have also have Graphic Studios been very generous to us over the years. So I'm trying to work on expanding representation of other important workshops like Brandywine and Self-Help and others. So, and as you pointed out, those are great ways to get sort of a spectrum of artists, across styles, ethnicities, interests, regions, everything.
Yeah, because there was a question earlier, like, what strategies are you putting in place, or do you have, or trying to implement to help, diversify and update the canon to include more voices? That is one that you and I have talked a lot about, is that it's a really good way to do it, to help jumpstart that process, is by getting some of those more archive impressions of, especially of regional workshops, or workshops that have a specific focus. So say like Crow Shadow, who is focused entirely on Native American artists. And, so those sorts of archives allow you to not only record a period of time in a place with certain people, but it also allows you to then use that as the beginnings of creating those new pots to draw connections from and to connect to at the same time.
Well, and the other thing that's been really great, I think, we've all been learning the wonders and horrors of Zoom and its potential. And one of the things that grew out of that for the Print Council of America is we have several different committees going on right now. And like many organizations, we have a DEAI committee, but we're really, so far we've used it to have several presentations from different colleagues that have been working on particular areas, or, inviting, like we just had a meeting and we had this really wonderful presentation by a conservator at Yale, and a woman who is director of the museum at the Tuskegee University, and the joint program that they've been doing for Howard students at Yale and conservation and cultural heritage and things like that. But we've also had presentations on people who've already been for some years making a real effort to collect Native American art or works on paper. Or I had E. Carmen Ramos and Claudia Zapata, who did the fabulous Printing the Revolution show that was up at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. While that show was up, they gave us a presentation on building that collection of Latinx artists, and the collectors that they worked with donated their collection. So I think there are a lot of opportunities like that we're trying to build, where we can educate each other as we learn things, but also invite guests who have areas of expertise to help us discover other artists. There was a Patricia, forgive me, I got my booster shot yesterday, so my brain is like not quite functioning fully. But the Patricia, her last name begins with the N. She's the new curator of Native American art at the Met. And she gave a lecture for the National Gallery. It was online, and you can find it under the CASVA, now known as the Center. It's online if you want to watch it. But she was making this really excellent point about, while it's good that we trade information as we learn things, that it perpetuates oftentimes certain artists that we all come to know and then we start to collect, and that we need to be more thoughtful about like really traveling and going to different parts of the country and seeking out new partners and colleagues that we don't know. To learn about artists that we never heard of who are doing really great work, to really help us expand beyond our sort of internal shared knowledge, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, and I can speak to that, having Catherine Blood, I was part of a panel. She had professionals in the field coming in and from wildly diverse backgrounds and perspectives to look. They put together, this is what our collection is, what are we missing? And then we all came in different waves and groups. This is pre-pandemic, so we were able to do it in person. But for us to be like, I think you're missing this, and somebody else if you're missing this. And one of the things that I talked about with their collection was the Library of Congress was really missing Native American voices in a big way. And I was like, now is the time to do that, because it's getting really expensive, because people are waking up to the fact that Native voices have been like not just erased, not just left out, but erased from a lot of it. And that you really need to focus on, trying to help that out. And I know that they were doing that. And there was other areas too, because their collection is so, specific based on similar reasons to yours, like big gift of Japanese prints, like ukiyo-e prints. And so I have a huge collection over there because someone gave them a pile of really amazing prints. And so it is hard. So, but it's really great to hear that, as a larger curatorial community, the desire to bring in outside voices, because as a publisher, people always ask, well, how do you find other artists? I'm always like, because I talk to artists, and artists tell me who I should be looking at, and then I spend the time to go look at them. And it's just it's a longer process, but you really, you just have to be willing to cast your net and see what happens. And to take that plunge, to do it. And it's not necessarily a linear process, but it's and it takes a lot of time and a lot of faith to spend that time. You got to get to know the work and get to know the artist. So it's
exactly. And I think it's only respectful of the artists to take that time to to get to know, to travel and get to see more, and where there have been collections. I mean, it's amazing, you know, the curators in the Portland Art Museum in Oregon, there's a curator there who's really been collecting for, you know, 15 years, which is not very long, but on the other hand, it's ahead of a lot of other people.
Right.
So, you know, they've had the chance, they've had more time to really get to know artists and think more broadly about the scope of Native American works on paper and what would make sense to collect, or who to go to talk to about what about in the 40s, like who are we from the 40s, you know? And I think it's in, you know, we don't know a lot of the biggest challenges, you know, pre-1900, where we really don't know, we can't know and may never know. Hopefully more research will turn up more information. But, you know, there were certainly, like the example that always comes to mind is Claude Hurst, who was a woman who used a man's name to show her work. She was sort of a John Pito, like still life painter. But who knows what other tricks like that or disguises people can, you know, manufactured so that they could create their art.
Right. So, yeah, to be able to work. I mean, it's, you know, I guess it's all ever more the reason to really take that lens of looking backwards of saying, what are we missing, and project it forward to saying what we can't miss moving forward. Yeah. Right. You know, I think that's a big part of it too. And, you know, which is, it's hard to do when you're, as an institution, you're tasked with forward and backwards at the same time. So it can be a bit challenging, you know, and for better or for worse, you know, myself included in this, we rely a lot on other dealers too, to see what's out there and what's happening. And it can be pretty challenging for everybody to be wanting the same stuff too, you know. So, well, like, and I think, you know, the bidding wars against the private collectors too can get really intense. And I think that's something that I think the average artist or art lover out there doesn't realize, is that an institution at times is also bidding against private collectors with unlimited pockets. You know, and you're just like, well, I'm gonna lose this one. I'm gonna try. I'll be out in round two if anybody shows up who knows what they're looking at, and you won't have it, or you won't be able to get it. You know, so that's the other part of it too, is that as you know, the art market goes more bananas and gets more expensive, it makes it harder for institutions to get stuff, even contemporary work for that same. You know, because contemporary work is crazy expensive right now in a lot of regards as well.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I think, you know, that's why, you know, collectors and donors are obviously very important to institutions. And, you know, sometimes, and hopefully there are some very generous donors who, you know, work closely with us, who, you know, want to keep in mind, they know what we have, they come to know our collections, and they consciously, when they buy for themselves, are thinking, well, this could end up, you know, we'd like this to end up at the National Gallery someday. We're going to enjoy it right now.
Right.
But we know it will have a good home and it will fit in nicely with the collection. We need more of that for sure.
Yeah. I mean, it's as a print dealer and publisher, I often am asking people when they're buying, what, you know, if I've been selling them lots of things over time, like what they're collecting it for, and try to pair them with institutions. Because it's, you know, we know what from a contemporary perspective as a publisher, you know, what's been moving and what's out there because you've been making it, you've been participating in that end of it, you know. So yeah, I mean, I can say on behalf of us that most of us do try to think of you guys.
Yes.
And say, hey, you know, where is this going to go when you're no longer alive? I know that's not the conversation you want to bring up in a sales situation, like, hey, you're going to be dead someday. But, you know, but you love the work, like, especially as a printer publisher, you know, we put a lot of our life and effort into making that work. We want to see it live on too. So.
Yeah, well, and I think, I mean, the last part, because I know we should probably wrap up, but the last thing I think is important to share is, I think we are also, we as a field are also trying to think about, how do we have built in biases about aesthetics and, and where do we have biases we're not realizing we have when we look at things and decide whether we should acquire it.
Right.
Because
right. And because we all have them, and we don't, the hardest ones are the ones you don't know you have. And I think, step one is a recognition of it. And then step two is a willingness to reach out to people with other perspectives.
Exactly.
And intentionally. So that way you're seeing something different, and there was a question just a minute ago. It says, what can an artist do to break into the canon? And I think, from my perspective, and I want to hear your answer on this one too, is make good work and be as present as possible. And I know that's a hard knock or a hard way to say it, but it's, getting it in front of eyes so that people can see your creative voice and then get to understand it and get to support it is the most important way. And so that you have people who will put you in front of other people, and will put you in front of other people, and put you in front of other people, because it is really hard. We're all humans with lives, and for me, I got 2 little kids, who suck up all my life, and it's hard to get out there for the news. So I rely on other people bringing stuff to me right now at this point, because I can get out to see less, So for you, is there a way in which
I mean, happen? I have to say, I think in terms of the works on paper world, this may sound crazy, and I don't know how others feel, but honestly, it's one of the reasons that even though it can take enormous amount of time, I do like to do juried shows, because it gives me a sort of temperature of what's going on out there. And I know it can be a pain. And I know that I also have a lot of little pet peeves about that. Like, if one more artist puts mixed media on their medium, I'm really going to be
flip out.
What the hell does that mean? Is it an etching? Is it a lithograph? Is it a collage? What is it? I'm looking at a digital image. No, but aside from that, I have become aware of artists through that process. And I think, you do sort of see, what's out there. I think also, the print fairs are really terrific. It's been great that IPCNY has been doing a great job. They had those sort of graduate school, that they had before the pandemic. They had, each graduate school had sort of a posting of things, sort of a booth with things that graduate students had done. The editions fair, the print fair itself, although, that counts on getting a dealer, and a dealer has to get selected. But certainly the editions fair, I think, has a more accessible vibe in that respect. And, working with people like you, Phil, I've encouraged a lot of artists to make prints with people, because that's how you get to know the printer, and then the printer knows you, and then you meet other artists who are working there. And, it's just another networking opportunity to get your work seen by different eyes.
Yeah, because I ask curators all the time who they're looking at, and institutionally, because, sometimes I'm at I just need my eyes shifted to see some other work. And I had a conversation with an artist this morning, and she was like, "Oh, I just did a studio visit with Clintel Steed." And I was like, "I don't know who he is." And so went and looked him up, and I was like, "That's awesome work. I should probably spend a little bit more time looking into that." And that's a lot of how it happens, is just our willingness to ask people, who are you looking at? Who should I be thinking about? And, and then you get sent in these directions where you find things that you never knew existed, but that have always been there and that are really amazing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that was my new artist for this morning. So, I was like, there you go. Twin Tail Steve,
Yeah.
never knew. And now I'm like, I really need to look at more of this work. And it's pretty amazing. So
That's
it's,
great.
yeah, I mean, it happens to all of us all the time. So I encourage everyone to get to know your friendly curators.
Yes. Well,
So,
and we need, and I think we're, it's good for us to remember to get out and about and do studio visits as much as we can. And, I think just think about reaching out. Right now, I try and think a lot about reaching out to different people, more people, to ask who I should be looking at. And
right,
colleagues at institutions where I don't know somebody very well, just reaching
right.
out to them and saying, oh, we're all rethinking our collecting habits and all of that. Who's somebody that you think I should be looking at?
Yeah. Yeah, I
So,
agree. Well, we can wrap up there because we have definitely talked for a while. I know you and I can
yes.
keep talking. So,
I
in
think
that
we're losing
regard,
people.
yes, we've lost a few. I want to say thank you to you for your time and your perspective, and it's always a wonderful conversation to have with you. And there's a note here from Robin Reisenfeld that the two of you need to have a discussion coming up
Yes,
soon. So I just want to pass that
absolutely.
on, make sure you saw that. And I want to thank everyone for coming out for the last episode of the book club. This will be up posted online soon. And after the new year, I'll give you guys the new schedule and some of the new conversations that we'll have. And so if you have comments on what you'd like to hear about or people you might want to hear from, please send me a note. And otherwise, thank you all for attending, and we'll probably see you in the new year. All right.
And thank you, Phil, for doing these. It's great that you do them for all of us.
You're welcome. It's fun. So have a good one.
Bye.